Okay, can you hear me? All right, good. So yeah, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about Wellcome to kind of give you the context of what my role is there as head of vaccines, and tell you a little bit about how I got there, and because I've taken quite an unusual route. And then what I really want to share with you is two of the programs that I've been involved in at Wellcome, which really link research with policy and have a public health impact. One is around the establishment of an R&D coalition that develops vaccines for epidemics and pandemics, and the other is around seeing an opportunity to bring research to policymakers in the cholera space. So with that, what have I done with my clicker? Here we go. So this chap is Sir Henry Wellcome, and I cannot give a talk without putting a picture up because he always has these amazing moustaches. But what's really important is that Sir Henry Wellcome is the reason that the Wellcome Trust exists. The Wellcome Trust was established in 1936, and Henry Wellcome gave us three very important things. He gave us his wealth, without which we could not do anything. We don't have any government funding, we don't have any donors, we are completely independent, and that means we have a voice, a credibility, which we can use in many different ways that governments and other organizations can't use. He also he was a complete kleptomaniac. He went all over the world and collected so many different items, and that was the basis for founding our museum. We have the Wellcome Collection in London, but we also have a huge archive. So if you ever want to know anything about medical related products, go to the Wellcome Collection, investigate what they have. They have so much there. But most importantly, and probably what you will recognize Wellcome for, is its mission, and its mission to improve health through research. So what this means is that we have a strategy that was developed about 3 years ago now, 4 years, and our strategy is to support science to solve urgent health challenges. And there are two ways that we do this. Firstly, through discovery research. We have two programs, Discovery Program and a Solutions Program. So the Discovery Program is what most people know Wellcome for. This is where we enable people to ask questions about life, about health, about well-being. And what we really want to do here is enable discoveries, new knowledge that has the potential to transform health in the future. So that is where the majority of our investment goes. It's where the majority of our effort goes. But a newer part of Wellcome is what we call solutions. And this is where we focus on some of the urgent health challenges. So we've identified climate and health, mental health, and infectious disease as the three urgent health challenges out there, where we think Wellcome, with our expertise, our experience in the research space, can link that with influencing through policy and advocacy to really accelerate different solutions to have a kind of 5 to 10 year impact. And so I sit in the infectious disease team. But before I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Before that, I just want to kind of explain that everything that we do, we ground in health equity and science. So the focus of what we do is science related, and health equity is the building blocks of what we do and how we do it. This is ridiculously bright. I'm glad I'm facing this way. So in the infectious disease team, we've got two main goals. One is to accelerate the discovery and development of products, and the other is really matching that with having an understanding of how infectious diseases emerge or escape. And you need these two in order to work together to control infectious disease. And this is a reminder that we focus on where there's gaps and neglected areas, and we focus where the burden of infectious disease is highest, and that's in Africa and Southeast Asia. So, what do we actually do? We're interested in two drivers of infectious disease, one on environmental drivers, and here we have an interest in vector-borne disease and waterborne disease. And on the other side, we're interested in drug resistance as a driver of infectious disease, and here we have a great focus on the bacteria. And under vector-borne disease, we're particularly interested in arboviruses, schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis, some of the neglected tropical diseases. Waterborne, really our focus is limited to cholera. We have a large TB program that really stems from the work we supported on a phase 3 clinical trial for a TB vaccine. And with our AMR focus, we're interested in those pathogens that mostly affect low and middle income countries. And as head of vaccines, we don't support vaccines equally across the program because a vaccine may not be the most appropriate modality to control a disease. But I lead the cholera work and I lead the TB work, and this is because our main focus is on using the current vaccines we have for cholera and also developing new vaccines for TB and gaining a greater understanding of protective immunity. But we also, my team works on arboviruses and also AMR and the role of vaccines in AMR. So how do we do what we do? You know that we fund research. That's probably the main area that you know about, but we don't just fund research from an open call perspective. Our discovery teams have lots of open calls, and the great ideas come from you and outside the organization. But what we do in the solutions team in infectious diseases, we have specific goals and targets. And we are more directed. We go out there to find who can help us to solve the problems and meet our goals. So it's a little bit more like how the Gates Foundation work. So yes, we fund research, but we don't just fund through open calls. We fund through consortia. We fund through public-private partnerships like CARBEX or CEPI. We also use our independence to work on advocacy and policy, so that the research that is generated to make sure that WHO can enable global guidance, for example, or a country can use that evidence to guide its policies. And none of this would be possible without the understanding of what the people who are most affected by these diseases need. So that engagement with the people who will be the recipients of the product. So are they appropriate? Are they designed in a way that they would be taken up by those people? So I'm going to move on to, how did I end up at Wellcome? And Mark gave a lovely kind of introduction, so I can whiz through some of this. So yes, I was at Birmingham. I had a wonderful 4 years there. But what I had 4 years, and one of those years was doing an MRes, because I wasn't convinced that research was for me, and I wanted to find out a little bit more about research. And I also applied to join industry at that time, and the people opposite me interviewing me, they all had PhDs. And I asked them, to progress in your organization, do you need a PhD? And they said no. But I looked at them and thought, not sure about this. And so luckily I loved research from my MRes, and then I thought, actually, I think a PhD will enable and open doors. So that's why I took the plunge and went and did a PhD at Imperial, looking at host pathogen interactions. I was fascinated by how the pathogens, how parasites, how parasitic nematodes could modulate your immune response in such a way that this one, Trichinella spiralis, could build its own nerve cell in the muscle tissue and remain for years within your muscle tissue, living symbiotically with pigs, with many different animals. So after my PhD, I did 3 postdocs, still at Imperial. My interest was on how cells move around the body, particularly this one cell, the mast cell, which is the cell that's jam-packed full of histamine, and you take antihistamines when you have hay fever, when you've got an allergic response. So this is the cell that's responsible, and this is midway through releasing all of its histamine granules. So I was particularly interested in how does it develop from the bone marrow into and how does it move from the bone marrow into the blood, from the blood into, say, the nose versus the gut versus the lung? What are those chemotactic signals that do that? And I identified a few. I also had 2 children in that time period of Imperial College, and it gave me the opportunity to really think about, what do I want to do? And I knew deep down that being a PI wasn't quite right for me. In the last postdoc, I had a team that I was building, and I was applying for lots of grants. And while I loved it, I needed more. I needed more direction. I knew I wanted to do some sort of more directional research and science. So I asked everyone under the sun about kind of what other careers are there, because I'd spent my whole life in academia. I didn't know what else was out there. So I asked loads of people. I investigated patent law, medical writing. I was fortunate enough that I already had a connection with Novartis through a joint PhD student, and I had set up a model in academia, an in vivo cell trafficking model that Novartis wanted to bring in-house to test their PI3 kinase inhibitors. So they made a role for me. And so that's why I moved to Novartis, where I set up the model, luckily successfully, so they kept me on, and then ran the in vivo, in vitro labs for respiratory exacerbation. I learned so much about building a team, managing a team, project management, portfolio management. I also led 2 antibody projects in early discovery all the way through to non-human primates. Learned so much. However, in 2014, Novartis had a restructure, and the site that I was at in Horsham, respiratory medicine, was moved to the US. Had 2 young children. It wasn't the right time for me to go. But they gave us 8 months warning. 8 months is a huge amount of time to work out what you really want to do. So I was very fortunate. Being made redundant, which is what eventually happened, was the best thing that happened to me, because it gave me the opportunity to investigate other careers. And I only actually applied for 2 other jobs. One which was medical writing, and I was really bad at medical writing. I sucked at it. It was awful. But the Wellcome Trust was the other organisation that I applied to, and it just felt like coming home. And I've had 3 different major roles at Wellcome over the 10 years I've been there. I was employed to look after their immunology portfolio, but 6 weeks after I started, the West African Ebola outbreak was at its height. And so I was asked, do you want to be involved in this little thing called Ebola? And I didn't really know when I said yes, of course, what that meant. It was my entry into global public health. It was my entry into understanding more about WHO. It was my entry into all things vaccines, clinical trials. And we didn't have any mechanisms in Wellcome. We didn't have a team, we didn't have any decision-making processes that could work so quickly. So I was very fortunate to work alongside Jeremy Farrar, who was our CEO, to guide me on how to do this internally, and just use a lot of sense and logic. And it was just, like coming home. The right environment for me to do what I could do best, which I didn't realise until I was doing it. So I was then asked to develop our epidemic preparedness strategy and a vaccine strategy at the time. From about 2017, 2016, Jeremy Farrar was very keen on bringing together research with the other elements that we had at Wellcome, so policy and comms, and to see whether by bringing that together into one team focused on certain areas, priority areas, we could have a greater impact than we could by having separate teams that weren't as well connected. I was so fortunate that I could spend a year developing a strategy. Didn't know how to do that. I asked for help from everyone I knew. I then managed to get the funding internally to implement this program. I could build a team from scratch. Who gets the opportunity to build a team from scratch? It was amazing. And then I could implement it. So from 2017 to 2021, this was the first 5 years of this vaccine priority area. There was another one on antimicrobial resistance and another one on diversity and inclusion. I mean, like many people, when 2020 hit and COVID came, that completely disrupted everything and we had to pivot. However, when we came out of COVID, the Wellcome Trust decided to reorganize itself to bring that stronger link between research, policy and communication based on the little experiment of these priority areas, one of which I led. And so half of the organization, that solutions part of the organization, which I showed you earlier in orange, that really is built around the little pilot that I helped to kind of prove a principle on. And I feel so fortunate to have been able to do that. So now I'm head of prevention, head of vaccines, which is all of our vaccine R&D, vaccine uptake. I also look after major initiatives, which will ask me, what does that mean? Big public partnerships, joint ventures with Merck. I've learned so much about organisations that I didn't think I would learn. But this is the thing that I'm most proud of. Over the 5 years, I developed a strategy which had specific key outcomes, wanting to improve or enable new and improved vaccines, a better use of vaccines, with 6 specific strategic areas, of which 2 I just want to go through with you. One was establishment of CEPI, and the other was around this link between research and policy for cholera. So, many of the discussions I've had over the last 10 years on epidemics and pandemics, there's always a mention of a panic and neglect cycle. So when you're in the outbreak, in the epidemic, in the pandemic, there's this fear factor that elicits panic, and there's lots of action and activity. We saw it at its height in COVID. And then when the outbreak, epidemic or pandemic goes away, we forget about it, we move on. We don't necessarily maintain that knowledge and implement that for the future. And so this is why this quote really sticks with me. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And over the last 10 years, I've seen many of the same questions being asked and not much progress. There has been progress, but not as much as maybe we could have. So going back to 2016, the context in which CEPI was established, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute, is there were increasing epidemics and pandemics. We saw that there were long-lasting consequences to the country's health systems. For these types of epidemics, not pandemics, so the kind of Ebola, Zika, Lassa, those type of epidemics, there's very limited or no commercial market, so there's not that pull factor of that commercial market. And at the time, there was no real vaccines or therapeutics or diagnostics that have been developed for any of those types of diseases, and there wasn't an organization that pulled it all together. And then also on the back of the West African Ebola outbreak, where we saw billions being invested in humanitarian assistance, the outbreak lasted more than a year. There were 30,000 cases. I say that now, 30,000 compared to COVID is nothing. But at the time, this was one of the biggest outbreaks that we had collectively as a global community come together on. And there really was widespread political support. And then if I just tell you a little story about the Ebola vaccines, this is kind of a timeline of the number of cases from March 2014 through to November 2015. And the blue spikes are monthly cases of Ebola, the red is the cumulative. So the arrow that shows the phase 1, that's when phase 1 clinical study, which is for safety, really, was conducted. So you can see that for the Ebola vaccine, Avibo. And you can see that's in September 2014. I started in June. This was amazing to get it done so quickly, but it was far too late. That's safety, which meant that the phase 3, which is efficacy, where you find out whether your vaccine works, wasn't done until March 2015. Now, you don't need to do a safety study in an outbreak. You could do that beforehand. If we were organised, if we were prepared, if we could invest beforehand, we could shift that curve so the phase 3 could start much earlier. That would save lives, and it would save a huge amount of money. And so that was kind of the context in which the idea of this coalition for epidemic preparedness innovations was established. And it really started with this paper by Jeremy Farrar, Adele Mahmood and Stanley Plotkin, suggesting a global vaccine development fund. And over the following year, so this was in 2015, over that following year through 2016, there was like a high-level discussion at the World Economic Forum, and that meant that then moved on to the Gates Foundation, Norway and Wellcome coming together to develop task teams, to develop a business plan, to then establish an interim CEO that happens to be Jon-Arne Rottingen, who is now the CEO of the Wellcome Trust. So he was involved in that from the very start, and then through to January 2017, when there was the launch of CEPI at the World Economic Forum with founding members and investment. And also at that time, they launched their first call for proposals for some of their priority pathogens. So it went very quickly, and this is just some familiar faces, Jeremy and Bill Gates and Paul Stoffels, Jon-Arne Rottingen. This was in CEPI 1.0, so the first 5 years of CEPI. And the initial investors were from Japan, Norway, Gates Foundation, Wellcome, and Germany, and then soon after other investors came on board because in their minds, the Ebola outbreak, we never want to be in this situation again. We want to be prepared. So it went very rapidly. So what is it? It's a public-private partnership with civil society organisations as well. And its role was when it was first established, was to stimulate, finance and coordinate vaccine development against a list of priority pathogens where there's no commercial market. And then fast forward 5 years, this is the Global Pandemic Preparedness Summit, where CEPI launched their second 5-year strategy. I've been fortunate enough to chair the investors group at CEPI, so this is all the governments and philanthropies coming together to maintain momentum to continue to invest in CEPI and the need for preparedness. And this was in London in 2022, so very much on the heels of COVID. So what has CEPI done? You know, it's all very well talking about CEPI this and CEPI that, but what has it done? What we need to remember is that vaccine development does take time. So it's made many investments in many different diseases. I put a few up here. I won't go into detail, but actually this is quite interesting. There are firsts that CEPI has supported. One is the first licensed chikungunya vaccine, the first Lassa vaccine in phase 2 clinical trials, the first medical product designed using AI that CEPI supported that is now approved it's the first one for any indication anywhere. And as well as supporting vaccine R&D, it also has these enabling projects. So what I mean by that is, in order to do vaccine R&D, you need to have preclinical animal models. You need to have lab networks around the world, clinical networks. You need to have manufacturing networks. And so they've built these networks. And the reason why CEPI can exist is because the majority of the products, majority of the diseases that they're focusing on, there's no commercial market. So that lack of commercial market means that it enables different organizations to work closely together. But we've got a long way to go. This is there's the International Pandemic Preparedness Secretariat. There's so many acronyms, I'm so sorry. But every year they produce a kind of scorecard that you can see here that shows progress on diagnostics, vaccines and therapeutics. And all you need to take away from this is the light blue is where no products have been approved, and there is a lot of light blue there. So yes, we've got CEPI, but we don't have a CEPI for therapeutics, we don't have a CEPI for diagnostics. We still have a lot of work to do, but we do have them for COVID, for Mpox, for chikungunya and Ebola. So there is progress, but there's still a lot more to do. So I want to bring us back to Wellcome. So Wellcome's been involved in pandemic preparedness, epidemic preparedness for a long time now. Do not read this. I just want to highlight the areas in pink. So yes, we support research, and we've made huge progress with integrating research into operational response rather than it being an afterthought. And in blue is kind of where we've established public partnerships. But the pink pieces, this is where we have supported, again, acronyms, GPMB. This is the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. It monitors progress we are making globally to be more prepared for future epidemics and pandemics. The IPPS is the scorecard. But also we have, through our museum and our public engagement team, we've been able to support what was called contagious cities. So a site in Berlin, a site in Bangkok, one in London, and one maybe in Thailand, Vietnam, to really open up the discussion with the public around what contagion is, what it means to those communities. And a little bit more detail about COVID. Yes, you know, we are a research organisation, but I just wanted to highlight some of the other ways in which Wellcome has supported pandemics. Research funding, yes, we fund research. We did fund research and discovery, biomedical, social sciences, but we also help the research community by giving them supplements or clinical breaks if clinicians wanted, needed, were compelled to help out in everyday challenges that hospitals were facing. We also were part of the ACT Accelerator, making sure that there was access to products for all people everywhere. Supporting the media, the number of conversations or explainers I did about what is a clinical trial, what is the regulatory path, and because we're an independent organisation, we have that credibility. We're an evidence-based organisation, so we had a role in that media because we weren't tied to any one product, we weren't tied to any one country necessarily, although people do associate us with the UK. And from a partnership perspective, not only did we continue our work with CEPI, but we also were part of the COVID Therapeutics Accelerator, trying to bring together a focal point for progressing therapeutics in COVID. And one of the pieces that we're most proud of is the lasting work that we've done around genomics and capability building in COVID that is now continuing in other diseases. And because we were all working at home, And the Wellcome offices is right next to a hospital. We opened up our offices for healthcare workers, doctors, nurses to come and have a bit of food, to have a sleep, to have downtime when they needed it. That was rather a strange transition. So Wellcome is more than a funder, is kind of what I wanted to say. And we have the flexibility to do many different things in different ways. I did want to, in the last, I don't know how long I've got actually, the last 15 minutes or so, I wanted to talk a little bit about cholera, because this is a very different environment. You know, many of you may think of cholera as an old disease, something that, you know, we've got a vaccine for it, it's not a problem. But cholera does disproportionately affect those communities, those people who are living in poverty, those people who are affected by displacement, by climate change. And you know, probably everyone here has seen in the news over the last couple of years the number of cholera outbreaks that we're seeing and hearing around the world. There's really been a surge in cholera outbreaks. And yes, we have a vaccine, we do, but the vaccine supply is quite minimal to the demand. So it's an old disease, we've had a vaccine for years, but there are still major issues and people are dying from cholera and they don't need to. So we've got, within the program that I run and set up in 2017, we have two specific questions that we want to address in the cholera space. One is around why do cholera cases occur and spread? And secondly, why is it that people still get sick? And because it's a preventable disease, but people still get sick and they die. So it's so bright, the white. So why do cholera cases occur? And it might interest you to know that we're in our seventh pandemic of cholera. You know, it's a pandemic that's lasted a long time. And on this schematic, it shows that in this seventh pandemic that started in 1961-ish, we've had three waves. The first wave was like in the 70s and 80s, the second wave in the 80s, 90s, and the third wave over the last 10, 15 years. And what we do know is that all of the cholera cases in this seventh pandemic stem from the Bay of Bengal, but we know very little more than that. We don't know how and for how long pandemic cholera strains can establish in different reservoirs between epidemics. We don't know the impact of weather, climate, environmental changes, how they trigger and drive cholera outbreaks. So there's a lot that we don't know. So we're funding some fundamental research studies to understand some of this, but they are long-term and they are multi-site. You know, the key question I always think is, why do people still get sick from cholera? Because, you know, in an ideal world, if everyone had access to clean water, cholera wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that the level of investment to build the infrastructure to have clean water in every country, that investment is a barrier. And also, it's a long-term investment covering multiple different governments over multiple different years. So that is a real challenge to having that infrastructure. So we do have vaccines, but vaccines are really like a band-aid. They're a short-term measure, but we do have vaccines. So why are people still dying? There's kind of three reasons. Firstly, the vaccines that we have, they're good, but they're not good enough. They don't reach the under 5, so they're not really effective on children, and they don't have a very long duration of protection. So we know at the moment that they last maybe 2 to 3 years, which means you need to keep vaccinating. The second issue is that the supply of vaccine that we have isn't meeting demand. So much so that we used to have what we called preventative campaigns, where we go and the global community, not me, go and immunize those areas that we know are hotspots or likely to have recurrent outbreaks in a preventative manner to prevent people getting sick. However, there have been so many outbreaks recently over the last few years that WHO have had to stop all preventative campaigns and switch to only reacting to outbreaks. And they've also had to reduce the doses. So normally you vaccinate with 2 doses of cholera. We've had to reduce that down to 1 dose because the supply is so limited. But we don't have an evidence base for any of this. So one thing we're trying to do to help build the supply is tech transfer of one of the oral cholera vaccines from IVI over to South Africa, to Biovac, but this takes years. So it's not ready yet, but it will be ready. It will come, and there's an effort in South Africa. There's another effort in India. So we're building the supply to hopefully meet demand, because actually we're down to one manufacturer of cholera vaccine at the moment, and that's not a good place for anyone to be. And then the third piece is around, we don't really know how to use the vaccines we've got. So we've now shifted to using one dose for reactive campaigns, but we don't know if they're effective. We don't know how long they're effective for. So we've funded multiple studies now to answer these questions, to answer the questions of how often do you need to revaccinate? Is one dose as good as 2 doses? Can we vaccinate pregnant women? These fundamental questions that you're like, well, we've had the vaccine for years. Why do we not know the answer to these questions? And in order to answer the evidence that comes out of answering these questions will hopefully help change policy. And that's where I want to end. We haven't just come up with these 2 questions on our own. We have spent the last 6, 7, 8 years working with policymakers. And going back to 2014, there was a World Health Assembly that revitalized the Global Task Force for Cholera Control. This is kind of a global task force for those countries and those organizations that care deeply about cholera. And it was a commitment at a political level at the WHO to say, yes, cholera is a problem. Yes, we will collectively solve that problem. And so if you've got the political will, that means that actually implementing is a lot easier than if you don't have political will. So that was in 2014. In 2017, there was this ending cholera global roadmap to 2030, which is fast approaching. And when we looked at this in 2017, when my team looked at this, there was no mention of research. Research was not really integrated into this. It's like, Wellcome has a role here. So and one reflection I had when we were talking to some of the ministries of health, the people who worked in the ministries of health in cholera-affected countries, when we asked them, what do you think about research? How's it relevant to your day-to-day work? They just didn't really, they didn't know. They weren't close to the idea, they just didn't really know. And that meant we had quite a lot of work to do, because if we want the research to be relevant to changing policy, we need the policymakers to know what research they need. So it's kind of this loop that we need the policymakers to demand. So this was in 2016, 2017, and I was quite shocked about that disconnect between policy and research. And we built this research agenda based on what policymakers said they had gaps, or what they would actually like to answer about, 1 dose, 2 dose, how to best effectively vaccinate children. And I know this program's been successful because 18 months ago I was at a Global Task Force for Cholera meeting on vaccines, and there was a person from a Ministry of Health who stood up and said, what we need research. We need research to help understand how we can vaccinate pregnant people. Now, that for me is like, okay, hallelujah, they've got it. They know what they want. They can tell us what they want, and therefore the research that we support can be more effective. So that's where I'm going to end. I just need to say thank you to the many, many different people in my team and across infectious disease who've helped me to support the work on cholera and to establish CEPI. And also, this photo was taken in Liberia. It was taken on the day that the Ebola vaccine results were published. And this little girl's family was struck down by Ebola, and she wanted to thank science. So she drew this poster, not her native tongue, and it reminds me about not forgetting who we're actually trying to help and support. And it reminds me to thank you all and to thank science. Thank you.